Well, good evening, and welcome to A Catholic Point of View, where we look at life through faith and politics in a Catholic lens. Tonight, I want to kick off a series of videos devoted to the Protestant Reformation, something I've wanted to do for a long time. I want to get into the nitty-gritty of what the church believes and what the Protestant churches believe. Hopefully, you'll join me for this little pilgrimage, and maybe we can learn a little bit together. Tonight, before I start talking about the man who started it all, Martin Luther, in 1517, I've got to talk about the Catholic Church and the erosion of the authority. If these events had not happened, the chances of these dissidents and Martin Luther ever arising would not be. First of all, the Protestant Reformation is not really a reformation. It was a revolt. It was revolting against the Catholic Church. The church did not reform any doctrine. What the church did do is they reformed bad behaviors, corruption, greed, politics, things of that nature. That's what the church reformed. But they didn't reform anything one iota, anything from the deposit of faith, the apostolic teaching, the traditions. They didn't change that. They didn't change that at all. And we'll look at that as well. But I want to talk about the century that just about undid the church, and that was the 14th century, a medieval century. It was a tumultuous time of wars, plagues, famine, you name it, politics, corruption, greed. All these things rolled up into one. We're going to kick it off in 1302, and that is the first incident of papal authority being eroded. But before I circle back to that, I have a timeline here, and this may help you kind of understand what the 14th century was about. 1305, William Wallace was executed, known as Braveheart, Mel Gibson's character. The destruction of the Knights Templar came in 1307. I may actually do a video on them as well. They're not the bad guys like Assassin's Creed says they are, the video games. 1310, many of you are familiar with Dante, the Divine Comedy. You've heard of Dante's Inferno and his vision of 9 circles of hell, and how a person lives is, and if they reject Christ, they're going to go to one of those circles. Very frightening look, actually, but it's a fascinating piece. So that's a frame of reference. 1314, Battle of Bannockburn was also, I believe, featured at the end of Braveheart. That's where Scots were trying to get their independence. A bad one. 1315 and 1317 is a great famine cut across Europe. 1321, 1328 is the Byzantine Civil War. Interesting anecdote. Byzantium is where Constantinople is located. It's known as Istanbul today. And here you have grandfather and his grandson, going at it, for the kingdom. Not good for family relations. 1328, end of the First War of the Scots for independence. The 100 Years' War. Can you imagine going to war for 100 years? World War II lasted only a few. World War I lasted only a few. But England and France seem to have a deep-seated hatred of each other, and they went at it for 100 years. Unbelievable. Fascinating things came out of that war. Encourage you to look at some of the history. 1347, probably I don't know, I can't really say it's the biggest thing to erode the papal authority, but it did play a role. The Black Death, the China virus, the virus from Asia that comes over and lands in Crimea and it spreads into Europe, all because of trade and commerce. So you have the Battle of the Blue Waters, the Golden Horde, a Mongol offshoot. They lose. Battle of Maritsa, 1371. There you have the Ottoman Turks, Muslim. They win a very, very large victory. Why is this important? And this will actually come into play when we get to Martin Luther. Yeah, it wasn't just Martin Luther that was on the scene and that was on the papacy's mind. Muslims started their faith in the 600s. They claimed that Muhammad claimed that he had gone into a cave and gotten all these visions and things like that. But the religion pretty much was one of the sword. They went out conquering. The Christian reaction took about 400 years before they did anything. Um, Muslims have been raiding along the coast. They have been ransacking. They took over the Holy Land. That's why the Knights Templar were there. There were 9 poor knights, and they were swearing fealty to their brotherhood, to live like monks, fight like warriors, and protect the pilgrims when they wanted to go to the Holy Land. So we have the Russians defeating the Mongols in 1380. 1396, the Battle of Nicopolis. And that pretty much rounds out that century. 1302, Boniface. Pope Boniface the Eighth. How unlucky can you be? I got to turn to my notes. Pope Boniface the Eighth was trying to stop Philip the Fair, also known as Philip the Fourth, King Philip, from taxing the clergy. Uh, in these days, the church tried to keep the church separate from the state, but yet the church viewed themselves as the ultimate authority. They believe, and still do, that God is above and that Christ is above and that his church is here and that spiritual matters trump secular and temporal matters. They certainly do for salvation, don't they? So he opposed him and he said something very famous. He said, there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church and those who are subject to the Roman pontiff. Uh, that sounds like earth shattering maybe to us in our modern 21st century ears, but all it did was it made the king angry. So the king had his French Catholic knights and men slap and beat up the Pope and imprison him. And he died of his wounds. Hence the humiliation. So the power for the church to say or do anything was subordinate to the state. Certainly at this time, people would take advantage of that. The king was very crafty. He was the one that actually put pressure to get rid of the Knights Templar because he wanted their money. And I may do a video on that later. So the weakness is starting to set in. And that's 1302. And then 1309, you have the decision, which is a fateful decision, not a good decision, where the Pope decides to move to France for protection. There are riotous rival mobs in Rome at this time, and the French crown was all too eager to welcome the papacy. So they set up shop in Avignon, France. And they stayed there and stayed there and stayed there. Uh, I don't have to tell you, but that upsets the other countries. They look at the Pope being in the hip pocket of the French monarchy. So people are like, "Is this the Christian life? Do we have to obey a pope? Do we have to do these kinds of things? What's left for us? The only church game in town is the Catholic Church. You did have some Eastern Orthodox at that time, and they had basically the same doctrine. It was just like a sister church. They just had disputes with the Bishop of Rome from time to time, but they still called him the first among equals, and they would argue. But that was it. So when he tells King, says there's no salvation outside of the church in unum sanctum, what's the king going to do? Well, he's not doing what we want to do. Let's slap him around and let's get us a new pope. And that's what happened. So he dies, and they do have to, elect another one. So they set up shop, and in the middle of all that, the Black Death hits. And you have about a third of Europe being wiped out in population. So things are getting really, really bad for the church. And people are starting to question the church. And I completely understand. It's not that. When I look at history, and maybe it's because I have a history degree, but when I look at history, I look at it a little bit dispassionately. I don't try to pretend I know what it was like to live in that time period because I didn't. Um, so yeah, I look at events as matter of fact, but this was a very, very bad time for the church. Let's talk about the Black Death. We'll talk about the Black Death. I'll go into Wycliffe, and then I'll make another video as we move forward. The Black Death had a huge effect other than just killing people. You got to realize that uh, the people depended on their priests. The people depended on the bishops. They had a higher mortality rate than anybody else because their mission was so important to provide spiritual comfort and aid and physical aid that they risked their own lives. It is noble, it is admirable, and it's unfortunate that they did lose their lives at the time because they had a lot of knowledge of the church and of the teachings, and they knew what was correct and what was incorrect. So you had this higher mortality rate, the duties to administer the last rites, provide spiritual comfort to the sick, to the dying, expose them directly to the plague. They were particularly vulnerable. It wiped out monasteries. These communal living arrangements in monasteries were breeding grounds for the Black Death, leading to entire religious communities being decimated. If you don't know what a monastery is, it's called a convent when the women gather. It's the male, it is a monastery, and the females are nuns, and they have a convent. One of their functions back then, where they were preserving literature, they were writing the Bible. The Bible was very hard to make, and it was very expensive. It took a lot of time. This is before the printing press. So that was an important work. Also, they kept the classics alive because after Rome fell, you had barbarian invasions, famine, and war, and destruction of libraries, and all kinds of things. So they were the centers of learning. So it's not good when they all start dying off. Some other things that were happening here. The pastoral collapse. With so many priests dying, many towns and villages were left without clergy. The dying often had no one to give them final confession, last rites. In response, the Pope started getting involved and started granting indulgences. And I will go over indulgences. Indulgences is not what you see in Hollywood. It is not something that, oh, I have an indulgence. That is my automatic ticket to heaven. It never has been that. It never will be that. But we'll get into that later. The decline in the quality of clergy, this is really, really important because the smart ones knew the faith. They knew what was true and what was not true. And if you don't know your faith, it can be corrupted. And in many cases, it was corrupted. They were telling people the wrong things at different times. They relaxed the standards. The church lowered the minimum age for ordination, rushed candidates to service to fill the gaps. This led to a large number of inexperienced and poorly educated priests. Not a good time for the church. Here are the ultimate questions, though, that are coming out of this. And you'll identify this. This will speak to you because this is something that you can apply in real life. The questioning of faith. The church's inability to provide a cure or explanation for the plague beyond calling it God's punishment caused many to lose confidence in the institution's spiritual guidance. The death of so many pious clergy members also challenged the belief that devotion could protect people from illness. Have you been here? I think you have. Have you said something like, my loved one died. Why? Why, God? Why did you do that? You could have saved them, even though God has numbered our days to begin with. But people will turn away. God, you didn't help me. I'm leaving. I'm not talking to you again. I don't believe in you. And so when they return to the church, they're like, why is this happening? And some could only come up with, God's punishment. You know, he's chastising us. He's disciplining us. And then they're watching the very, very pious and holy men that they look up to, and they're dying. They're like, well, why does God wish the death of them? This is the time they need to be alive and caring for us, and now they're gone. So you can see where the cracks are forming. You can see this fertile ground for dissidents and nationalist movements are rising and things like that. And so you get to somebody like Wycliffe. Wycliffe wrote a Bible, and I've seen some memes. Usually every year it talks about how that the church mistreated Wycliffe and things like that, and how dare they? He's just trying to put a Bible in English. The church was very afraid of misinterpretations. They were afraid of grammatical errors, word choices that would lead somebody astray. Therefore, if you were going to put a language of the Bible in the vernacular, the common tongue for that country. So if you're in England, you want it in English instead of Latin. If you were going to do that, you had to get permission of the church. Church chained Bibles so they wouldn't be stolen. They were so expensive, they wanted them there so everybody could read them. It was not a matter of suppressing. Now, occasionally you find a couple of little minor councils, maybe in France or something, you might find an anecdote of a bishop restricting access. But that was just a bishop exercising a prudential judgment at the time. But that was not widespread. So the church wanted you to have permission. But let's look at Wycliffe, and then we'll wrap it up. Wycliffe was a professor at Oxford. He was a very learned man. He's not stupid. He wrote De Logica in 1360. And I picked this one out that he wrote. on the truthfulness of Holy Scripture. Now, I, as a Catholic, uphold Scripture, and I go to Scripture often. But I also know that the Scripture did not come first. The apostolic tradition, what was passed down, came before the Scriptures. And the Scriptures themselves even say that the church is the pillar of truth, because all these teachings and these things were not immediately jotted down. But you may like this. He really sounds like a modern day Protestant. So he believed in the truthfulness of the Holy Scriptures, which I do too. That was in 1378. He did the apostasy in 1379. That was not a very nice one about the Pope, if I recollect correctly. All right, so Wycliffe was born in 1324, and he died in 1384. So he got to see the Avignon papacy. He got to see these famines. He got to see a lot of these terrible things, all the violence. Professor of philosophy and theology, pure academic, intellectual man. He just expressed his ideas. I love to be around professors because they're wonderful, and they're not always right, and you can tell they're not always right. You can tell they're acting out of a base human inclination or motive, but they usually have some really good stuff that you can learn from. So, it would have been interesting to hear this man out back then. All right, he opined that the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, which is communion, is not real flesh and blood, but is symbolic. Many Protestants believe that, not all. Lutherans have consubstantiation with the body, with the substance. He advocated Donatism. I guess the best way to say it is that, so to a Donatist, if you were baptized at a young age and that pastor, that bishop or deacon that baptized you or priest went astray, became a nut, rejected the faith, he would say, well, your baptism's not real anymore. The church comes in and says, no. The sacraments being performed don't hinge on that person's personal morality and propriety. So that was a heresy that St. Augustine wrote against, but that is one that Wycliffe enjoyed. He believed the state should be above the church. He believed in confiscating church property. He's not really endearing himself to the Pope, that's for sure, with this kind of stuff. But the worst thing he did, and this is after being censored by the Archbishop of Canterbury, he called the Pope the man of sin, Lucifer's member, and he denied free will. So he was a piece of work to the Catholics. But they didn't have much authority back then. It was all being eroded. So they couldn't really go after him. And he had a guy named John Gaunt. He was a duke, and he was the son of Edward III, the reigning king in England, and he protected him. They protected him from any kind of harm, anything other than just a normal censure. The popes would write against him and things like that. One of the odd things that they did, I don't know if you want to call it petty, but they used this to do an example, is that after Wycliffe died, all the way into 1428, they dug him up and burned him to make a statement. And that's not the only time they did it. We're going to go into another incident where they did similar things, or at least the state did. Wycliffe is the origin of a lot of your Protestant doctrines and faith that you hold to. I would say Luther is probably coming in and refining a lot of these things. I don't know if you knew it, but when Luther submitted his 95 Thesis, number 71 says he actually is not criticizing papal indulgences. He was criticizing they were being misused and things. But you got to realize he started off a Catholic and his views started to change. So these are the cracks. I'm going to end. I guess not with Wycliffe. I'm going to touch on this. I'm going to end a little bit with the Western Schism because you didn't just have one pope. You didn't have two popes, but the Council of Pisa elected a third pope. So this adds a lot of confusion, and this is also a reason why they can't reach out and touch uh, Wycliffe. Their authority is eroded. You know, you had this group called the Flagellants that walked around whipping themselves. You see them in some medieval movies. They're journeying and they're flogging themselves. And the church wanted to suppress that. They were like let's knock it off. It's not what we do. But they didn't have the authority anymore. So the problem with the different papacies is that once the Pope moved back into Rome at the behest of St. Catherine of Siena, which had this glorious quote to get the Pope in Avignon, Pope Gregory the 11th, I believe, to move back to Rome. She says, she's a mystic, by the way. She's illiterate, but she experienced powerful visions, and she relayed them. She went up to Pope Gregory the 11th, says, be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire. Return to Rome and be the shepherd, not the wolf. And of course, he listened. He listened. But he died. They had another election. They had election of Pope Urban VI. And Pope Urban VI was a pious man. He set out right away to reform corruption, weed out these excesses, church properties, and things like that, buying and selling offices. He was cleaning house, but he was also an abrasive personality, is what I've read. He would basically tell them in the open, shut your face. You know, and they didn't like that. They didn't like it. He was very blunt, caused a lot of problems. So the French cardinals went away mad because he was elected, and they elected their own. So you had a French cardinal, and then you had a Roman cardinal. And then the Council of Pisa met several years later and they said, we're going to solve it. We're just going to elect one. So now you basically have one real pope, which is the one from Rome, and you have two anti-popes. And we'll get into that one was deposed and one voluntarily resigned, and Martin V took over. And it looked like that the Council of Constance and conciliarism, the fact that you have a council judging a pope and electing a pope and things, they wanted to bring that up, but Pope Martin V said, no, 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 I reject it. It's just, we've always had the line's unbroken. And the claim is that the Catholic Church has an unbroken succession from Pope Leo XIV all the way back to the Apostle Peter. So that was intact. But join me next video and we will talk a little bit more. Also, I'm going to put up on my Facebook the Spanish Inquisition video that I did. The reason why I'm doing that is because it really explains heresy and how heresy was a threat to destabilize a nation, cause riots and mayhem, and no king and no emperor like that. So they did not like heretics, and when the church judged them, in some kind of trial, the state had the leeway of saying, okay, we're going to banish you or we're going to burn you. So until next time, thanks for sticking with me. God bless, and I will see you soon.